In an era where high-concept TV shows now feature impressive visual effects, sprawling fantasy worlds, and elaborate costume design and makeup, how does a show that mostly takes place in a white windowless office end up being one of the most visually striking TV shows ever made? Flip through popular shows today and you'll see a lot of the same kind of thing. Vaguely floaty, handheld, and Steadicam shots that drift around characters without a lot of clear motivation. The lighting is soft, low contrast, and imprecise. I'm not saying all of this is necessarily bad cinematography. There's a lot of variety and range and quality among the shows shot in this style. But we've seen it countless times, and I want to establish what the baseline is for a lot of current TV so we can see just how stark the contrast is when we go from this to this. Severance immediately feels distinct in the midst of the crowd. This is even more impressive when you consider the fact that the show could have easily been incredibly visually boring. A lot of the shots are effectively someone speaking in front of a white wall, someone speaking in front of a ceiling, or people walking through a hallway. Even the cinematographer herself almost didn't sign on because she had concerns about shooting a show that takes place almost entirely in a sunless office, but yet it works. So how did they pull this off? How did the creators of Severance transform what could have been bland and mundane into something that isn't just visually unique, but which also tells a compelling visual story? Our first clue is found here, in a photo of an unassuming, empty corporate office. A subject so mundane and bland that the idea of documenting it feels almost absurd and pointless. But the longer I look, the more I see something unsettling. This is just one of many photos found in Office, a photo book by Lars Thunbjörk published in 2001. At face value, it's just a documentation of offices from the 90s. But both series director Ben Stiller and cinematographer Jessica Lee Gagne cite it as a key visual reference for the show. And there are little details in this book that are reflected directly in the show, like this particular shade of green carpet. A closer examination of this book will reveal something deeper, something surreal and almost sinister in the images that will reveal the soul of Severance and why the look of the show is more than just an attention-grabbing aesthetic. But before we understand why the look works so well, we have to understand what it is and how it was constructed. And I'm going to do that without any major plot spoilers, so if you're not caught up or you haven't seen the show, you're safe to keep watching. The cinematography of Severance, at least within Lumen, where the majority of the show takes place, is about rigid camera movement, striking composition, and control. Jessica Lee Gagne, the show's primary cinematographer, might not have a lot to work with in terms of variety of locations or light, but she uses the space to its absolute maximum, finding new and interesting ways to shoot and compose these spaces throughout the show's 2 seasons. Take, for example, the way scenes are staged and shot in MDR, probably the room the show spends the most time in. It's a minimalistic space where the characters mostly sit around this desk, but the way each scene is shot still feels distinct and presents the space in a new way. For example, sometimes all the workers are balanced in the composition, but if one of the characters is the primary focus for the scene will often be established with shots of them from the perspective of their computer. A scene that cuts primarily between these 2 shots feels visually distinct from one that cuts between 2 shots that look like this. It's a great example of how powerful of a tool composition is. Many of these compositions use distinct striking elements, textures, and lines from the set to pull our eyes towards the faces, create conflict through contrast or division, or create frames within frames. The show's precise use of composition makes it feel immediately unique in a sea of shows where composition sometimes feels like an afterthought. Severance's use of color and light also makes it feel distinct from almost everything we're watching these days. Instead of the low contrast, soft and washed out lighting, we see high contrast and stark lighting with bright whites and very dark shadows. This is what sets Severance apart, but I want to go beyond this because I'm interested in what separates a unique visual style from a truly meaningful one. Well-shot TV shows look cool. They either develop a unique look that sets them apart, or they take the standard look and just execute on that really well. But for me, a show with a truly great visual style, one that exists in the category of best-looking shows of all time, has to go beyond either of these. It's not just about originality, it's about whether you're using the look to truly communicate your story. And this brings us to the secret ingredient that I think is key in crafting visual masterpieces, and that's intention. The stark walls and sterility of the severed floor aren't just arbitrary stylistic choices. They reflect the inhumanity of Lumen, the blank slate nature of the severed workers who exist cut off from the outside world and information, devoid of memories. The angular and boxed-in compositions aren't just a cool way to catch your eye, they're a visual expression of the way these characters are trapped and imprisoned by their environment or internally divided by severance. Within Lumen, the camera pans and tilts were not manually operated, but electronically controlled using something called a remote head. It literally gives the camera movement a robotic, inhuman precision. And the only time handheld is used within Lumen is to show a breach in its unrelenting control. When we leave the severed floor and follow the characters out into the real world, the visual language of the show, of course, then changes, highlighting the separation between these two sides of the show. The bright white walls, even soft overhead lighting that is cool and neutral gives way to darkness, dramatic side lighting, and warmer lighting with more free camera movement. In Mark's house on the outside world, Gagne wanted each scene to feel like it was lit with only a few practical lights that Mark himself turned on. I think this creates an interesting contrast where, in the world of Lumen, the overhead light feels ominous and relentless. Audi Mark lives in a darker realm with harsh but dim lighting, yet it's lighting he controls. It illustrates how something that's more visually appealing on a technical level can become oppressive when our ability to control that environment is stripped away. Lumen feels like a sterile prison, and the outside world feels much more free, but one isn't obviously better looking than the other. We need to understand why these Audis are willing to subject themselves to severance in order to escape their world. This is what I mean by intention. Extensive thought was obviously given to what each choice that went into constructing the look of this show communicates to the viewer. Intention means asking whether the way the camera moves or the way Mark's house is lit helps the viewer understand the world of the show and the internal landscape of the characters. But it's not just the cinematography that's filled with intention. It would be a mistake to talk about this show and not mention the intentionality with which this world was constructed in the first place. Some of the credit for the look of the show definitely has to go to production designer Jeremy Hindle and his team. Crafting a world that feels both beautiful to look at, but also seems to hide a surreal menace beneath this thin artifice is an art in and of itself. Hindle created this world by taking inspiration not just from photography of real offices in the 90s like this, but also from artists like M.C. Escher. Escher drew surreal maze-like images of impossible realities that are often contained inescapable loops, a feeling that is frequently reflected in the hallways and passages of Lumen's severed floor. He also took design inspiration from Jacques Tati's movie Playtime, a film which also offers a humorous and playful critique of corporate offices. Perhaps most impressive is the show's distinct flavor of retrofuturism. Its technology and design elements feel unmoored from time, contributing to the sense of liminality. The world we see when we watch Severance, from the design of the Lumen logo and the buildings down to the camera movements and the furniture, was crafted with the intention of using the visual language of the show to communicate something. But what exactly is being communicated here? What is this timeless liminality, controlled minimalism, and empty sterility saying to us? Office by Lars Thunbjörk isn't just an arbitrary visual reference. I don't think Ben Stiller chose this as a visual foundation for the show simply because he thought it looked cool. Instead, there's something more elemental captured in these images that gets at the heart of what Severance is trying to convey. Art critic John Berger, in his essay The Ideal Critic and the Fighting Critic, says that what we get out of a work of art on the most profound level is the memory of the artist's way of looking at the world. For Berger, what art captures is a way of seeing, a perspective. As someone who is highly critical of the dominant economic system in our world, Berger was especially interested in how these perspectives could help people understand and claim their social rights. For Berger, the important element is less the subject matter of a work of art and more how it's conveyed. He says this is how Goya can paint a massacre in a way that doesn't glorify them, but asserts that we should be able to do without massacres in the world. So we want to consider, what is Lars Thunbjörk's way of seeing the office spaces, and how does that compare to Severance's way of seeing? To me, Thunbjörk saw these spaces in a way that reveals a fundamental inhumanity. Even when people appear in the photos, it feels like they're not thriving there, but existing in spite of the cold, lifeless container that surrounds them. Any stark, abstract beauty that we might find in these spaces comes not from the spaces themselves, but the way Thunbjörk forces interesting compositions out of them. What I find striking, though, is the way that humanity seems to assert itself in spite of an environment that is attempting to diminish it. Presented without context or description, we wonder what kinds of work went on here and who the people were who spent long hours in these offices, perhaps with little or no access to sun. They seem to exist out of time and space. These photos present offices that feel like anonymous silos meant to contain humans that are there merely to facilitate the movement of data, working at the direction of those far above them in the corporate structure that they may have little or no direct access to. One is a book of documentary photos, the other is a science fiction television show, but both of these works to me seem to contain a similar way of seeing. One of the most brilliant science fiction writers of our time, Ursula K. Le Guin, once said, "Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive." And this is, to me, how I understand Severance. It's not about solving the technical mystery, about figuring out what the goats are for, although those kinds of things are fun to talk about. Instead, I see Severance as a metaphorical, surreal reflection of our own reality. We see the basic functioning of corporate structure, office work, and life under capitalism, but with a sense of time, place, and other labels scrubbed away. This allows us to perhaps see with fresh eyes our own predicament. I'd argue that Severance is one of the best looking shows ever made, not just because it's technically well crafted and visually unique, but because the visual language of the show speaks and reveals a way of seeing the world that communicates something to us and resonates deeply with us, even if we don't fully understand it on an analytical level. Take, for example, these shots of characters switching between their severed selves. These are brilliant visual depictions of the mechanism of severance as it happens in the show, but they're also a perfect emotional metaphor for a moment so many of us have experienced in real life. That moment where you code switch for a professional environment, shutting off or pushing down some very real part of your personality or emotional life that is incompatible with the environment you have to be in order to make a living. This is how the look of Severance works on a visual poetic level. Sometimes the visual choices feel like they have a very concrete meaning, like the compositions that highlight the divided nature of the characters' selves, or the compositions that highlight how the characters feel trapped and blocked in by their environment. But even if you haven't worked in an office that looks like this or this, I'd venture to guess that part of why you connected so easily with these characters is because you relate to how it feels to live and work in this environment. Visual language can communicate difficult, mysterious ideas that we struggle to put into words, but that's the beauty of film and TV. You don't have to put it into words. You can see it and feel it. The question is, what do we learn by applying the way of seeing that Severance gives us to our own world? Does it, as Berger says, help us better understand our human rights, even if it's just to show how they're being violated by systems of power and control? Severance does these things with the storytelling, the writing, and the performances. But I also think if you turned off the sound and understood none of the dialogue, the core premise of the show would still be communicated just through the images. There's not many television shows I could say that for. This is how the best films and TV shows are more than just entertainment. They reflect the world around us in a way that gives us a new, fresh perspective on our own environment, provoking us to ask ourselves why it is the way it is, if it needs to be that way, and what it means to try to live as a human in such a world. Maybe it's a coincidence, and maybe it isn't, that Lumen appears to be run by boomers. They get a bad rap, but are they really to blame for all the wealth inequality in this country? That's the question Tom Nicholas investigates in his documentary Boomers, a Nebula original, which you can watch right now on Nebula, alongside a bunch of other incredible content from other creators. On Nebula, you'll also get all my regular videos without any ads or sponsorships, as well as exclusive videos, like my video about the time I edited both parts of Dune into one film and then watched it all in one sitting. You can find links to all of this, including my channel on Nebula, below, and if you use those links or the QR code on the screen to sign up, you'll get 40% off the annual plan. Nebula is an affordable service that gets you early, ad-free access to a ton of thoughtful content, and if you already have it, you can now buy gift cards that allow you to gift Nebula to other people in your life you think might enjoy it. Head over to Nebula and watch Boomers to see if they're really responsible for the world that Severance is critiquing. When you use my links or head to nebula.tv/ThomasFlight, you're going to get that 40% off the annual plan, and it supports the work of creators like me. So thank you so much to the viewers who have supported my work by signing up for Nebula. Please try to enjoy every video equally.